I used to be a park ranger when I was a bit younger. I did it for quite a while, from 95 to 2004, and then I had a career switch. During my time as a ranger, I had moved around a couple times to different locations all around the Great Northwest. My job was pretty normal on a day-to-day basis, but I've had a couple of dozen strange experiences that I can't really explain. There were also several incidents that I was told I was not allowed to discuss or ever talk about. You'd be amazed at the stuff other park rangers and the people up above know about that civilians have no clue. The particular instances I'm going to be telling you about is how on numerous occasions I had found these so-called abandoned staircases just out in the middle of nowhere. The first one I ran across, I had probably been a ranger for a few years already, so I'm thinking it was 97, 98, or something like that. It was still wet and cool, so I'm thinking early spring. My job then was surveying, and where I was at the time was pretty far out in the middle of nowhere. I'm talking a good 20 plus miles from any roads or civilization. I had come to a clearing where in this smaller pasture was this Gothic style spiral staircase. I was so weirded out by this. I decided to inspect further, and I discovered that it was actually fairly new. It hadn't been weathered down yet. There was even red carpet that lined each step that looked fairly new too. What I don't understand is, why would walking to the very top do anything for anybody? It literally led nowhere. Why would someone bring one of these out here in the middle of nowhere? The second time I encountered one of these would have been the following year in the summertime. I was in northern Washington at the time, deep in one of the national forests, and in the middle of the forest was another staircase. This one looked older and was made of stone. I would guesstimate that it was probably 10 to 12 steps tall, where it looked like it just dropped off into nothing. The third time I ran into one of these things was the year that I quit, 2004. I was actually with my supervisor at the time, and when we both saw it, my supervisor was pretty quick to have us move on and continue doing our job. He seemed nervous. His demeanor was strange, like he knew something. He told me not to mention it to anyone or my other coworkers. I thought the entire thing was bizarre, but I just took his word for it and wrote it off. Years and years later, I got curious about some of the things I had seen and experienced during my time as a ranger, and I looked it up. I guess it's a much more common occurrence than I thought, and many other ranger and Forest Service peoples have seen these staircases all over the country. What the hell are they used for? Are these portals that come in and out of this world? I generally don't believe in all of this nonsense, but I don't know what to even think anymore. How? Tell me, how do you explain these hundreds of staircases just left in the middle of these forests? It makes no sense to me. I was assigned to an area in southern Idaho for a while back in the 80s as a park ranger. During my tenure as a ranger, I had a lot of Bigfoot encounters you would never believe. It just so happened that the area I was in was a very active area. I've had encounters with these beings up close, aggressive, and calm. There was one time I must have gotten too close to one of their dens because I heard a lot of screams, howls, and whoops, and had actual pieces of logs thrown in my direction. Had I not moved out of the way, I would have been a goner, taken out by one of these logs. There were multiple times at night that I would hear all sorts of wood knocking and the likes. Whooping was a common sound to hear around at night and even during the day. There was another time I had seen a whole family of Bigfoot traveling from one ravine to the other side. I'm assuming the alpha male, because of how large he was with the female and 2 little ones. This male was pushing 12 feet easily. I mean, this thing was humongous, built like a bulldozer of a body. The female was quite smaller. I would say 8 feet, and I could see what looked to be breasts hanging from her chest. The little ones kind of reminded me of chimpanzees. Very lanky looking, but very odd looking as well. They even acted like children. Misbehaved, wanted to wander and not follow their parents' direction. It kind of looked like they got scolded at some points, but I'll never know for sure. One of my scariest experiences was when I had heard what sounded to be a bunch of ruckus and noise in the woods, and trees rattling and shaking. It was howling and screaming. After having the other Bigfoot experiences, which I never told anyone about, I just kept it to myself. I figured these sounds were 2 Bigfoot fighting each other. I must have been right, because a little while after, the sound had died down. I went to go investigate the area to find out what had gone on, and I stumbled upon a Bigfoot corpse. It was mangled, beaten, and pretty bloody. I didn't get too close to the thing, but from 30 feet away, I could tell this huge black hairy mass had to have been a dead Bigfoot. I knew then that the sounds I was hearing was this thing fighting with something. I didn't get close and inspect it in detail, but I saw fair amounts of blood. I decided to leave the area and contact my immediate supervisor. The very next day, I was removed from the area and stationed in a different state entirely. I remember the phone call I got shortly after I told my boss. I was basically told by his boss that I was scheduled to be stationed elsewhere because they didn't need my services in that spot anymore. It was still the strangest call to this day that I've ever gotten. It was so out of place, and I feel there was something more to it than just a rescheduling of sorts. This actually took place back in the 80s, way back before I was park ranging and doing that stuff. I used to guide in Idaho, specifically the Chamberlain Basin. Back then, we would go in there for weeks at a time, on horseback, and I would guide hunters in. This basin is miles and miles of woods, and the wilderness is thick. I'll never forget the one time that I encountered a strange old man in my adventures. On one of my guide tours, we were probably a few miles in at this point, and getting ready to set up camp, when we came across an old shack. My first initial thoughts were that it was an old abandoned hunting shack used long ago. As we approached it a little closer, our horses started acting nervous and wanting to go in the other direction of the shack. I thought that was weird, so I tried to steer my horse on course, and we were successful, but as we were passing the shack, the door opened up and this old man stepped out. All of us, including me and the hunters I was with, couldn't believe it. This old man, who had to be at least 70, looked pretty feral and had zero trace of humanity left in his face. You could just see it on him. He wore it. He was filthy, wearing just a loincloth. The disturbing part was his attire besides the loincloth. He wore on his head a stag's skull, adorned with weird trinkets and gems, much like you would see the natives have, or witch doctory, I guess. He also had what looked to be human skulls made into a large necklace that he wore around his neck. He appeared to have some sort of wooden wand-like object in his hand that also had a rotted-looking human skull. He glared at us for a few seconds, watching us closely, examining and calculating every move we made. Muttering something to himself, he ran back inside. It happened so fast, none of us said anything to him. After we were a little ways away from the shack, we were pretty convinced amongst ourselves that that was indeed human skulls, and we believed he could have possibly murdered people out here. It made us pretty uneasy, but the further we traveled away from him, the more we forgot about that crazy old man. We ended up setting up camp just a few hours later. When we ended up crashing out, and all of us were asleep, I awoke to the sound of rustling around our campsite. It sounded like a person, and it was getting closer, and then I heard more rustling. Before I could even think, I heard a gunshot and a scream, and then what sounded like someone running away. I quickly jumped up and got out of my tent. I saw one of the other hunters standing there with his pistol, his tent torn up and him looking at me, pale-faced. He told me he was awoken when he saw a dagger plunge into his tent and tear downwards. He pulled out his pistol and fired, not knowing if he hit the person trying to get into the tent or not. Whoever it was ran off. I couldn't help but think of that crazy old witch doctor looking man that we had seen earlier, and he had come out of the shack looking at us. But I didn't want to say anything. The horses were pretty shaken up. Me and the other hunters were shaken up too, but we prevailed on to the next day and didn't end up encountering anything else strange again for the rest of the trip. I never did tell the police about what I had seen. I figured it was just some witch doctor hermit who had murdered those who had come by. He had several human skulls around his neck, and one on his wand-like object, like I said previously. I don't know how he got them, and I'm glad we didn't find out. I just remember getting bad feelings when we went by a shack that first time. I knew from the get-go something wasn't right. I guess I shouldn't be surprised it was probably him who tried to attack one of the hunters I was guiding. Not me, but my brother, who is a bit older than I am, is a park ranger and has always had some rather interesting accounts out in the wilderness. When your occupation involves being deep in the woods for days at a time, I guess you're bound to see all sorts of stuff. Now, my brother can't reveal too much information for fear of him losing his job, or even worse. He tells me in this instance he was working in South Carolina, checking out several parts of the wilderness for something he wouldn't tell me about. He says he was hand-picked to work on this special project that would be used for different means. One project he worked on was an expansion project in which he had to travel deep into the woods and survey different parts to see what areas would be best for expansion. I'm not too keen on the details, but whatever. I just know in this time, he was out in the Francis Marion National Forest. What he told me next deeply disturbed him and I. He said he reached a part in the woods where things got really quiet. He said the hair on the back of his neck was standing straight up, and he started getting nauseous, but had no idea what was causing this. He then started getting this fear, this raw, primal fear. He had to continue doing his job and reach the GPS coordinates he was sent. Things went on like this for around another 15 minutes, he said. The forest was so quiet, you could hear a pin drop. He said he was extremely uneasy and thought about backing out. He said the next area he walked into was the icing on the cake. Before he entered this clearing with trees, he started to smell a really bad odor of rotting meat. He started hearing the loud buzzing of flies. As he approached the clearing nearby was when he saw it. There were at least a dozen of them, if not more, from fawns to does, even a few bucks. Skinned, mutilated, ripped open, all forms and varieties of mutilation hanging up in the branches of trees. There was so much, my brother told me this grisly scene looked like it was something out of the movie Predator. He went into great detail because my brother stood there in horror, taking it all in before leaving and failing to reach his given coordinates. He said a few of the deer that were strung up in the trees, which were high up in the trees, mind you, 30 plus feet up in the air, were only partially skinned and mangled. Some of the deer had their guts partially ripped out and hanging, while others, limbs and heads, were completely torn off their bodies. Not cut, not surgically clean cut, torn, as if some madman had ripped it off with its hands. He said the smell of blood and rotting meat was so overpowering, he began vomiting profusely before retreating. He didn't even want to think about how all those deer got put up there. Who or what even did it? I asked him if he thought it was a person that did it, or a hunter for whatever reason, and my brother just told me he had no idea why anyone, especially a hunter, would hang any deer 30 to 50 feet up in a tree, mutilate them, and leave their guts hanging and partially skinned. Why? They weren't gutted. These were mutilated in different ways. He tells me no person would be able to do something like that, especially not with their hands. He reminded me that these deer weren't cut, they were torn apart. When he had to report back to his boss about what happened, they actually did not believe him. He got in a lot of trouble for it, but he still refuses to go back there and deal with what he did.